begin. We've been going through a course led by Professor Yossi Turner called Modern Humanism and Jewish Thought. And we've come a long way. We're on our fifth session today. Today we're going to be talking particularly about the Sabbath, but from the interpretation of labor Zionism. Professor Yossi Turner is a professor emeritus of Jewish thought at the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem and a University of Florida Center for Judaic Studies visiting professor. Professor Turner?
Okay, thank you very much, Rick. I'll begin as I normally do with a short explanation as to how our topic today fits into the overall theme of the confrontation between Jewish thought and modern humanism. Just recall, I guess, that the theme that we're doing today, which has to do with what we'll call modern humanist interpretations of the Jewish Sabbath in modern Jewish thought, particularly Zionist thought. The last two thinkers that we're going to be doing today and next week are representatives of labor. Actually, one was maybe the founder of the idea, in some ways, both of modern Zionism and socialist Zionism. And the second, who we're going to do today, Nachman Sirkin, was actually the founder in practice of what we call labor Zionism. And as I said, I'd like to start off by explaining what this topic has to do with the confrontation between modern humanism and Jewish thought. Anybody who knows a little bit of the history, and I'll just go into a smattering of it, will already understand that once we're talking about Jewish socialists or socialists with a strong Jewish consciousness and identification, that socialism is very, very closely tied with modern humanism to begin with. And so you can already see from that perspective why labor Zionists who write about the Sabbath would be very promising and fruitful as an expression or reflection of this meeting. Okay, so how does this topic fit into the overall confrontation between Jewish thought and modern humanism? And once again, if we just recall in one sentence or two the thinkers that we've touched upon already, we know that we're speaking, when we speak of modern humanism, we're speaking of different facets of the modern approach to reality. And as I mentioned and repeated a number of times in this course, that in this modern approach to reality, the God-centered approach of the Middle Ages was replaced to one extent or another with a human-centered approach to reality in the modern period. And that is probably the most basic component of modern humanism, is the centrality of the human being in both understanding and creating reality. And this, of course, comes with all kinds of implications in the area of ethics, tradition, society, and we have no need actually to go into all of them, every aspect of life, the transition from the theocentric, God-centered worldview to the anthropocentric, human-centered worldview in the modern period just has tremendous implications for every facet of life. And then once again, when we take a look at those people that we've already touched upon, Moses Mendelssohn, Rabbi Nachman Krochmal, Theodor Herzl, Achad Ha'am, right? All of these people and many others who just didn't make it into the course sought to integrate aspects of modern human ethics, scholarship, philosophy, and probably other areas as well into their Judaism. And most of these figures, if not all, were also interested in exposing, perhaps correctly, what they believed to be similar or related values in Jewish biblical and rabbinical texts, meaning that historically, of course, modern humanism grew out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and therefore it's a modern, chronologically modern phenomenon. But all of the thinkers that we spoke about, without being disingenuous, right, being very honest, found the presence of many of the values that we consider modern humanist values already in Jewish sources. And this, of course, notwithstanding the God-centered worldview, which was dominant when virtually all of Judaism's sources, basically from the Bible until the Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, were constructed. Anyway, what is important that all of those that we've studied until now were still part of the relatively early modern attempt to synthesize and at times harmonize traditional Jewish perspectives, or an aspect of traditional Jewish perspectives, with perspectives of the Enlightenment and subsequent demands of modern civil society. Once again, without going into it, the Enlightenment is the chief expression in modernity of the turn to humanism. Okay, now, so that's the thinkers that we've touched on until now. The two figures whose writings we will now be taking up today, which is Nachman Sirkin, and next week, Moses Hess, continue in the same direction of the other thinkers that we've done earlier, in that they too, both Sirkin and Hess, are also interested in synthesizing or harmonizing aspects of their Judaism, Jewish background, Jewish tradition with the demands of modern humanism, particularly in the context of socialism. But these two thinkers, Sirkin and Hess, or maybe I should say Hess and Sirkin. We're doing Sirkin before Hess here, but historically Hess preceded Sirkin. In any event, both of these individuals, Hess coming from the first half and middle of the 19th century, Sirkin the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, both of these thinkers, partially because they're later than the worldviews already expressed in this course, are much more radical, and they're radically different. They have radically different attitudes than the thinkers that we've already studied, even though, like them, they can be considered under the rubric of the meeting of modern humanism and Jewish thought. This is because Moses Hess, once again, from the first half of the 19th century, it means that he was working in what you might call the earliest periods of Jewish modernity. Remember, for the Western world in general, modernity is very often presumed to have begun with the later Renaissance. For Judaism, for Jews in Judaism, if we take out a few, the really wealthy merchant class from Holland in the 18th century, in the 17th century even, for almost everybody else in the Jewish world in the West, and we're talking about the West being Central and Western Europe or Americas, right? Modernity, once again, only begins with emancipation in the, let's say, the beginnings of the 19th century and full force in the middle of the 19th century. So that when Moses Hess, who is working already, and I'll even tell you a little secret about Moses Hess, he's the guy we're going to work on next week. Very often, we know things that are going on in Central Europe in the 19th century. Moses Hess also was from Germany. We know of two names that are very often mentioned together, Marx and Engels, right? The founder of communism and the broadening of the socialist idea in many respects, but really the founders of the communist idea, which is just one of the socialist ideas running around the time. But very few of us know that it was really a threesome. It wasn't only Marx and Engels. It was Hess, Marx and Engels. Moses Hess, Karl Marx, and Frederick Engels. What was Engels' first name? I think Frederick Engels, right? Were day in and day out working on programs, writing things, and Hess left Marx and Engels when he rediscovered his Jewish identity. Anyway, we're going to leave that all for next week. I only pointed this out for you to realize how early Hess is in the history of Jewish modernity, even though he's not that early in the history of Western modernity in general. The beginnings of emancipation is the beginning of the 19th century. And this is the first half of the 19th century that we're talking about. Once again, Sirkin, who we'll be talking about today, Hess, who we'll be talking about next week, were radical socialists and Zionists with aspects of modern humanism providing the common denominator between Judaism and Zionism for both. And that's what we're going to be investigating. I already said a few words about Hess, who we're now going to leave until next week. You should know that Sirkin, Nachman Sirkin, once again, so let's say Sirkin is 60 years younger than Hess. I haven't done the exact arithmetic, but that would make sense. He is a very interesting figure. I mentioned a moment ago that one of the reasons that Hess and Sirkin are different, even though they're part of the same rubric, than the other thinkers that we mentioned, is because of their radicalness. It's their lateness on the scene, at least for Sirkin, not for Hess, that socialism becomes the expression of humanism. Remember Mendelssohn, it was really Enlightenment liberalism was the expression of humanism. For Krochmal, it was historical study. It was the humanist scholarship. And with Hirschenson, it was liberal religious interpretations of the Jewish law. And that's what we did, I think it was last week, right? When we come to Sirkin, we can see a very big difference biographically as well, having to do with the fact that he's coming at the end of the 19th century, because Nachman Sirkin, who grew up as a poverty-stricken Jewish youth in the Russian Pale of Settlement toward the end of the Tsar's regime. Okay, it's going to go on with ups and downs for another 15 or 20 years once we get into, I'm emphasizing the ups and downs of the 20th century, right? But Sirkin, so he's in the Pale of Settlement at a time in which the Jewish economy totally collapsed. By the way, not only the Jewish economy, all of what's now mainly the Ukraine and other areas, but then was the Russian Pale of Settlement, was all poverty-stricken. It was the only place in the Russian Empire that Jews were allowed to live unless they were really lucky and had some kind of a special permission. And in the 1990s, there developed in the Pale of Settlement, I guess, a generation known as the radical Jewish youth that was deliberating what to do with the conditions of existence, and particularly Jewish existence in the Pale of Settlement, that had gotten so bad, far worse than any of us can ever imagine. I mean, the only thing we can really say about this is that we know how bad it was because it caused 2.5 million Jews and many others to emigrate, right, to flee Russia during that time. And it was really a matter of find a solution or you're going to starve to death. And there were other problems as well. In any event, Sirkin was one of this generation of the radical youth of Jews whose biggest interest was finding a solution for themselves and for the people living around them to these material problems. And what's really very interesting when you look at Nachman Sirkin, and there are a number of other people like this. One of the other members of this group that I'm mentioning now is this fellow by the name of Nathan Birnbaum, who actually coined the term Zionism. Right? What's interesting about these guys, Nathan Birnbaum, I'll start with because he's a great example. Very often you would think that the person who coined the term Zionism, you would imagine was probably a Zionist. And Nathan Birnbaum was a Zionist when he coined the term Zionism. Right? He thought that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was the solution to the problems of Jewish existence and modernity, particularly with regard to those of the Pale of Settlement, we can say, right? Except that Nathan Birnbaum, and I don't remember what order this was at one time in his life, he's a Zionist. We're talking about the period of a decade or a decade and a half. He was a Zionist. He was an ultra-Orthodox political, anti-Zionist political leader. He was a radical socialist. He went through virtually every camp that you can think of among the Jewish youth. And what I'm trying to say is that whereas today we very often think of all these different ideologies and camps as being forever against each other or side by side, at the time that many of these ideologies, particularly the Zionism that preceded Herzl, in the Pale of Settlement, and many of the other movements as well, went through a number of movements, being encouraged by one as the possible solution and then being disappointed by it and moving on to another movement. What were the movements that Sirkin went through? He started out as not a Chad Ha'am, connected with the Chad Ha'am, but as a lover of Zion. That's the pre-Herzlian Zionist movement whose center was in the Pale of Settlement. From there, he became a radical socialist, joining many of the revolutionary groups, let's say of which somebody like Trotsky grew out of. Nothing to do with, why? Because Jews thought that the situation was so bad and there was maybe no room for Jews or Judaism in modernity. And the way to solve the material problems of the Jews was by solving the material problems of all of those who are disaffected in Europe, whether they be the recently freed serfs or workers in general, right? All who are discriminated against, their socialism wanted to change the social order in order to help all of these people. So there are people like Sirkin and many others who thought that was the solution to the problems of others' Jewish existence, and then realized there was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in the socialist movement. And so he came back to Zionism, but now it's Herzlian Zionism, and which he thought political Zionism was necessary because it was just going to take too long for socialism to revolutionize Europe. But he couldn't stand Herzl and Herzl's people being so bourgeois, being so middle class, because this guy's a proletarian socialist. And so he remained in contact with Herzl, and at some point even joined Herzl's territorialism that was looking for a solution to the Jewish problem on a geographical or state basis, even if it's not in the land of Israel, then came back to the Zionist movement, and in 1899 wrote a pamphlet called The Jewish State and the Problem of the Jews. And in that pamphlet, there were a couple of things he wrote a little earlier. He actually founded what has been known today as socialist Zionism. And just one last remark about that, how would I call it? The privilege, not the privilege, the praise that socialist Zionism may deserve goes way beyond its being a really interesting synthesis of Jewish particularism and Zionism and modern humanism. In socialism, socialist Zionist actually also is what turned about half, or at least many, we'll leave it like that, of the young radical Jewish youth in the Pale of Settlement of the 1990s into a workforce that emigrated to the land of Israel, started what's known as the second wave of Zionist emigration. And actually that was the beginning of the process of building a new Jewish community in the land of Israel. Until that point, there were individuals who came, there were ideologies, but the actual movement of building began in the second, around 1904, the second wave of Zionist immigration, that was a result that grew out, that formed its Zionist consciousness in the land of Israel on the backdrop of the Zionist socialism, the socialist Zionism that Sirkin had created. The other things that is necessary to know about Sirkin before we go into the text, which will be in just a few moments, is that while Sirkin grew up in the Pale of Settlement, and that's where he became radicalized, like many others in the Pale of Settlement, sometime, I think it was early in the 1990s. I shouldn't say, I don't know the date. Like many other of this youth, went westward to Western Europe to get a university education. While he was in Europe, Sirkin was much, much more interested in debating, in developing social theory, in organizing, in writing pamphlets than he was going to class. Eventually, he did write a doctorate, and it's excellent. And it even influenced his work, but that's besides the point. So now he's a radical student, Jewish student organizer in Europe. From there, he sends pamphlets back to Russia that had nothing to do with Zionism or the Jews, had to do with the revolution against the Tsar. And he himself went back to Russia a couple of times. It was known that he was going to be arrested, so he left, went back westward. Around 1906, 1907, he arrived in New York City, moderated many of ideas, realizing that humanist and social ideas in America can actually be attained with or realized without revolution. And he changed many of his views when he got to America. And one of the other things that's it, now he's in America. There are probably two fellows more than anybody else on the Jewish Lower East Side from the first decade until, let's say, the late 20s, who are more active as political and labor organizers than at least anybody else I know. One of them was this fellow called Zhitlovsky, I forget Zhitlovsky's first name, who was a non-Zionist diasporist, who was a labor organizer and social theorist, and also started developing theories of Jewish culture. And the other one was his best friend, or one of his best friends, the socialist Zionist Nachman Sirkin, just in order to show once again how these ideologies, thought processes, value orientations are connected with real problems and with real realities. And so it's not unusual for Sirkin and Zhitlovsky to be the two central figures on the Jewish Lower East Side in anything that had to do with labor at the time, even though Sirkin's attention was mainly put to Zionism and Zhitlovsky to the diaspora Jewish community. Okay, so now, as I said, we're going to go into Sirkin's texts. And since Sirkin is talking about the Sabbath, it'll certainly be helpful for us to take note of a few of the quotes concerning the Sabbath that we find in the Bible. This, of course, is always a challenge. You read somebody's text, you see a few words and may not even know that it's a quote taken from the Bible. Or if it is, you may not know how it appears in the Bible. Here, we're going to see that both Sirkin and Hess are very interested, even though they're secular, in some ways anti-religious, they're very interested in not betraying the original contextual meaning. It's like they'll never understand the Sabbath the way the Orthodox Jews do. But when they read about the Sabbath in the Bible and they want to understand it for their purposes, they go to the Bible. And that's what, so we'll start with these few statements that say that Sirkin bases himself on. All of us, what we need to do is recall that the Bible begins with this story of creation that takes place on 6 days, and on the seventh, God rested. That's a part of Western religious culture. It's certainly a part of all Jewish education. Certainly Hess knew the Bible really well. He knew this really well. Next, we should note, and this Sirkin knows as much better than I do, I would say, all Jewish holidays, at least the major festivals, the three major festivals, plus the Sabbath, according to Jewish tradition, and sometimes you get a biblical text that will say this almost explicitly, all major Jewish holidays, including the Sabbath, were given in order to recall creation and the Exodus from Egypt, right? So even though it's tradition that puts these together, the Bible already very often thematically has done that. And this is a very, very interesting and important thing for, in general, to understand anybody reading the Bible, right? At least the first few books, can't deny either the centrality of the creation story and who God is coming out of the creation story, nor the centrality of the story of the Exodus from the Egyptians, of the Israelites from Egypt, and who God is as the Redeemer of Israel. So the fact that the two have become part of the infrastructure, somebody like Sirkin would say, and I agree, it's part of the infrastructure of Judaism through the ages. You take either one of them out, almost nothing of later Judaism, or much of later Judaism will no longer be there if you take those away. And so the question is, so what connection can there possibly be between the idea of a divine creation of the world and the idea of a redemption from slavery in Egypt? And the answer to that is that the Bible appears to view, or to view an intrinsic connection. Right? Here's the point that Sirkin is going to develop. That the Bible seems to view a connection between the creation and the Exodus from Egypt, first of all, empirically, in that the Sabbath is noted as being, and other holidays are noted as being in memory of both. So it's clear already biblical tradition, even more so later rabbinical tradition, put them together for some reason. And my question is, so what was its understanding that caused it to put them together? And here I think we can begin to understand if we take a look at exactly how the Bible recalls creation and how the Bible recalls the Exodus from Egypt. So when it comes to creation, it's very obvious, it's explicit. God creates the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. Of course, for us, it makes no difference at this moment whether one believes that this is a metaphysically true statement, that there is a transcendent God who existed before the world and then created the world, or if one thinks that this is a literary story, a drama that was placed at the beginning of the Bible in order to prove a point. For us, it makes no difference. For us, what is the empirical fact of the fact that this connection has been made. And if we want to understand the Bible, the Sabbath, as a remembrance of the creation of the world, we can do so very easily by understanding the chief ritual of the Sabbath. There are a lot of detailed laws concerning the Sabbath, but they all come under the rubric that on the Sabbath, we are obligated to rest. And that's a very obvious ritualistic function, right? God rested after having created the world. We reenact God's involvement of creation by us resting after we work 6 days of work in creation, the seventh day. So it's clear, but even by the ritual and not only by the statement, that's how we recall creation, and it's a creation of divine creation, right? It's a divine creation. But here's the funny thing, is that when the Bible goes into in the two renditions of the Ten Commandments, In the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, there is an emphasis that, at least logically speaking, you would never think comes up from the idea of creation. It's even more pronounced in Deuteronomy than it is in Exodus, but already in Exodus, you're told that not only do you rest, but you have to let your servants, your slaves, the strangers, everybody rests. Now that's interesting because that's introducing a social value, a social principle into the ritual of recalling creation. In Deuteronomy, it says even more than that. There it says, it doesn't deny that the reason one has to rest on the Sabbath is because God rested on the seventh day of creation, but it says, it adds or says explicitly, you have to let the manservant, the womanservant, the stranger, you have to let everybody rest, right? And because of that, God sanctified the Sabbath, because you knew the life of the stranger when you were slaves in Egypt. Again, the Bible is explicitly tying the two together. So what does it appear that happens here? What happens here, it appears that there was an initial belief in the divine creation of the world. This already distinguished Israelite religion from most other religious cults in the area that were based around embodiments or personalizations of forces of nature. Here you have the transcendent God who created all of these. But then, and it would probably happen around the time of the prophets, but we don't have to go into it, that idea, probably because of either Israelite history or some tribal history of some of the tribes who became a part of the Israelite people, however it happened, probably because of some historical experience, the God of creation, who by that already has power of the entire world because he created it, right? This power of creation, the divine, becomes manifest in the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea. Not only as a power, he's not only a power of creation, he's also a saving or redeeming God that introduces, in a manner that introduces into the idea of creation, social values or ethical values. The idea of saving or redeeming from slavery is a social value. It has nothing necessarily to do with the idea of creation, unless you presume one thing, that the values of either human equality, human life, dignity, however we want to describe these values, unless we were to presume that these values actually have their root in creation, as though we were to believe, as though I'll put it succinctly from my own experience, learning the Bible and other things first as a young child and then growing up. The picture that stays in my mind after having gone to Jewish religious schools, even though I've adopted many ways of thinking that my teachers would never like. I said something about the historical development of the Bible. My teachers would never stand for that. But nonetheless, what's the picture I get after learning all this stuff and going back to it again and again is that the Bible has a conception of God in which the values, the human values of dignity, equality, and other such values as well, are not merely pragmatic values for the betterment of society. They're not merely values that human beings think are proper oughts, things we ought to do, things we ought to be. It may be all of that, and probably is, but actually that they're rooted in the value orientation of the universe as established in creation. Almost, if we use the fundamentalist or human description of God, God created the world in order for these values to become fulfilled. So first we have, again, this is a part from a historical development. But if you have a story of creation and have your story of the Exodus from Egypt, you put them together, and this is the picture of God that comes up. He both created the world and apparently did it for a purpose. And you see, by the way, much of Jewish tradition, even when it talks about the Messiah or the end of days and the prophets, all they're really talking about is that ethical or a value, ultimate value realization that's already symbolized in the Exodus from Egypt, but is to be realized only at the end of history as the fulfillment of creation, which stood at its beginning. So there's a real organic, integrated, principled relationship between the notion of God as creator and the notion of God as redeemer in the idea of Sabbath in the Bible. And just for this part, this is all the background we need. Yes. Another thing that is important to know is that in the Bible, there's not only one Sabbath. It's not only a Sabbath that comes one every 7 days. That would make perfect sense if the meaning of the Sabbath was only to recall the divine creation of the world. Then you would have it every 7 days, the way that God created the world in 7 days and then rested. Except that in the Bible, you found something else. We actually find 3 kinds of Sabbath. One is the weekly Sabbath, and which everybody has to rest. And then there's what you might call a yearly Sabbath. After 7 years, there's a sabbatical year, just like you have to rest on the 7th day Sabbath. On the 7th year, the land has to rest. It's clear that this too originally was a reenactment of God's resting on the Sabbath day, except that later on, the Bible includes not only making the land rest, and maybe I should mention the 3rd Sabbath, after 7 cycles of 7 groups of sabbatical years, there's the Jubilee year in the 50th year, which symbolizes the Sabbath of history. It symbolizes the future end of days. And in these Sabbaths, not only are people ordered to rest, but anybody who sold himself into slavery out of poverty rather than die of starvation is freed. Anybody who sold their land because they couldn't make payments, they had lack of funds out of poverty, they get their land back. Any debts that are made are canceled in the 7th year. So in addition to the ritualistic recollection of creation on these Sabbaths, we also have the foreshadowing of what's meant to be the ultimate ethical realization of humanity in the end of days, what's considered the time of the Messiah or the time of redemption, as both Judaism and Christianity would have it. So all these things together form the materials that Sirkin is working with. What Sirkin, however, is interested in doing now is going to ask the big question, right? Where does it all come from? What does it mean? And he goes into, for what at his time might have been considered a somewhat scholarly discussion, but this fellow, Sirkin, is so inspired. Let's just see what he does with it. The first thing he does, because he's a total secularist, and by the way, he's an anti-religious in the sense that he can't stand rabbinical Judaism. He thinks it's tyrannical, but he loves Bible and Jewish sources. And so what do we have here now? I want to go to the text. Yeah, here we're going to the text. We'll go to the first paragraph. Just know, by the way, this was written already in a later stage of his writing or a middle stage of his writing. It's translated from Yiddish. I think it's around 1913, if I'm not mistaken, that this was written. And he does the most natural thing for a secularist, who a free mind, who can look beyond the tradition he's been taught, saying, wait a second, isn't there a coincidence that the central ritual of the Jewish religion is the Sabbath? And we know that preceding the formation of Judaism or Israelite religion, there were actually people who worshiped the sun. And I forgot to tell you that, and you probably know, in Hebrew, actually the Sabbath in English is just a rendition of the Hebrew word Shabbat, right? And Shabbat, how we call it, there was the group of people who worshiped the sun, at least, I don't know when this began, if this is accurate anthropologically or if it's later reflections presuming, but in Sirkin's mind, he's aware that Maimonides, for instance, already talked about Judaism having in some way been a response to the religion of the Sabbateans. And the Sabbateans, according to Sirkin, maybe it's true and I just don't have information in the area, was sun worshipers. I'm sorry, not sun worshipers, I'm mixing it up. Saturn worshipers. And so before Sirkin even begins, he has this etymological theory that the Jewish Sabbath somehow comes from these earlier Sabbateans who worshiped the planet Saturn. And now we can see, now we have to go into the first text. See, I gave it the title, Sabbath History and the Great Idea of Humanity. He's starting with Judaism. This is the Jewish Sabbath. The Sabbath is the holy cloak that hovers all over human culture, right? Why? Of course, we can only understand what he's saying here if you know the social and humanist values that are attached already in the Bible to the Sabbath. And it's because of that, he thinks the Jewish Sabbath presented an idea to humanity that didn't exist beforehand. It is the ethical light which enlightens humanity's path. Once again, think not only of the 7-day Sabbath, but how Sabbath also orders history in the biblical tradition. The human, right, this, I'm talking about the Sabbath, the sabbatical, and the Jubilee gives the Sabbath a historical structure. The human being first appeared as a free spiritual personality in the context of the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, the human being is redeemed from his initial humiliating connection with the earth and overcomes slavery. This is even before the story of the Exodus from Egypt, according to just the fact that a person works and then rests on the Sabbath is a freedom from slavery for Sirkin. And it overcomes suffering through a heavenly gaze at the future of human history. I'm just going to stop here for a moment because except for the last few words, it reminds me of something that Achad Ha'am had written about 7 years, no, just around this time too. And whether Sirkin was aware of it or not, but Achad Ha'am wrote an essay on the Sabbath where he has a very famous line and says, more than the Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. Said in the long intolerable exile when Jews experienced themselves on the lowest ladder of society, came the Sabbath and looking toward heaven would rise to the highest level. By the way, Achad Ha'am, like Sirkin, was an atheist and yet still looks to heaven because that's a part of the culture. Of course, God here would be an image, not a metaphysical reality. Okay, now we continue. It says, on the Sabbath, the human being is redeemed from its initial humiliating connection with the earth, right? Being a slave to the earth in order to be able to eat, and overcomes slavery and suffering through a heavenly gaze at the future of human society. The Sabbath here being the expression of the ideal, the messianic age when everybody will be free and justice will lose the land. Heine, right? Heine, the Jew who converted and yet remained Jewish in his soul. Heine once said that the Jew is a dog. I mentioned Achad Ha'am. Heine brought, Sirkin brought Heine. Heine once said that the Jew is a dog for 6 days every week, and only on the Sabbath is he truly human. The poet's words are equally valid for the entire history of culture. The Sabbath is the gift that the historical God gave to human beings so that they may progress from being individuals to constituting humanity. And of course, what's implied here is that Sirkin, as a socialist, sees individuals, when individuals think of themselves only as individuals, then they're all selfish and exploitative. When human beings think of themselves as part of a human community, they develop responsibility, and the Sabbath makes the individual into part of a community. I think this probably draws from his own experience as a Jew in the Jewish community on the Sabbath, but also that Sabbath laws are all addressed to the community, and it's a part of the community culture. Other than that, it's hard. He might actually just mean only that when the Sabbath tells you to let others rest, right? You're already creating community, even between the head of the household and his or her servants, right? Because by letting them rest, you bring them on the same level as you. And anyway, you can see it's breaking the selfishness of the individual who's only concerned with his or herself. Okay, in this way, the idea of the Sabbath and what it includes for Sirkin is as a cloak that was given to humanity, you might say, in order to remind itself where it came from, but even more so to know where it's supposed to go. For Sirkin, and we'll see this next week with Hess as well, the Sabbath is what changes human history from a historical history into an idealist, perhaps you would say religious history, a holy history of ethical ideals, right? By the way, just to maybe hammer in a little bit, something that we all know and corroborate something I said before. You know that there was a discussion at one time, I guess it would have been about 50 or 60 years ago, maybe more, as to why is Israelite religion considered the beginnings of monotheism when already in Babylon, there was already a concept, or there was in Egypt a concept of one God. And if people say that Judaism is the first, that the role of ethics in Judaism, as we're seeing here on the Sabbath, right, is the beginning of ethical religion in the world. If in Babylon there was already Hammurabi's Code, which was an ethical law for all of society and looked on high for its basis. The answer that's normally given to these questions is that all the components were there, but it's biblical religion that created the idea of a God whose highest interest is that injustice, righteousness, love, and so on and so forth, rather than separating the two realms. In any event, that coincides with the way that Sirkin understands the development of the Sabbath that we're now going to read, because it's here that he's going to ask the question, where did it all come from? And he begins from the ancient peoples, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, Arabians, the sun, the moon, and the celestial spheres lay at the foundation of religion. Right? And therefore we have Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and so on and so forth. And Saturday, the day of Saturn, right? The origins of the Sabbath are found in the worship of Saturn, a part of nature, going back to the old Sabbateans. And yet the Jewish people became different from the all others and developed historically into a unique people, into a people with its own unique spirit, into a chosen people as the Sabbath, this is the point, as the Sabbath of nature, right? God resting after 7 days of creation, was transformed into a Sabbath with a special social spirit, into a holy Sabbath. And now he's trying to show how this idea of the Sabbath, or the transformation of the Sabbath, from being, let's say, metaphysical or cosmic to being ethical and social, he says, pervades all of Israelite religion. And it's really clear in the Bible. He says, Cain, the farmer, killed Abel, the shepherd. We can ignore some of his prejudices, right? It's clear for him that the shepherd is on a higher level, an ethical level than the farmer. I think that's a prejudice that probably isn't well-founded, although it might be, you never know. But anyway, so Cain killed Abel, and the vengeful God, the God of justice, the God of the oppressed, demanded payment in blood from the evil brother. So all the way at the beginning of the Bible, you already have the connection between transgression between sin against God and ethical and social ethics, right? God, yeah, what difference does it make that one sacrificed to God with an animal and the other sacrificed to God with agricultural products, right? And that the point is that one came upon the other and killed him. And that God couldn't take, showing he's not only the creator, but he's the creator of the world with an ethical orientation. And so the vengeful God, the God of justice, the God of the oppressed, demanded payment in blood from the evil brother. This God bequeathed to Abel's offspring the finest gift in his treasury, the holy socialist Sabbath. And of course, what he's doing here is he's seeing Abraham's family as a continuation of Abel's offspring, which is quite strange, since if I remember correctly in the Bible, Abel didn't have any offspring. So of course, what he's referring to, he sees the Israelite people and the heritage of the socialist Sabbath as a continuation of the God's preference for Abel as the weak and damaged party who was actually murdered, and now God is asking for justice on that. Okay, and even so that original story doesn't mention the Sabbath at all. But for Sirkin, it's obvious that the value orientation of the Sabbath and the value orientation and God's exacting justice is one at a time, one and the same. And he continues with this. And now we don't have to get into a conversation as to the chronology of the Bible. You know, there's a different chronology if you use the traditional reading of the Bible or the way the Bible presents itself, and if you read a critical reading of the Bible. If you use a critical reading, and then even much of the older parts of the Bible only came around in the time of the prophets and were anachronistically read into the past. This is not important for us, how we should read the Bible chronologically. What is important is that according to Sirkin, the transition from the Sabbatean worship of Saturn through the Israelite concept of creation into the Israelite ethical understanding of the Sabbath, right? Will now come through where he says the Sabbath stands at the base of prophecy. He thinks it's the prophets that made the ultimate radical change in the developing religious tradition from the Sabbateans to the Israelites. And so now he sees the Sabbath in general as a product of prophetic creation. The idea of the Sabbath is a product of prophetic creation, and now is going to read the Bible on the Sabbath through the eyes of the prophets as he understands it. And he says like this: the goal of the Sabbath is to be holy. This is explicit in the Bible. For 6 days shall thou labor, while the seventh is the Sabbath for God. Thou shalt do no work. We already talked about this. And then Sirkin continues, thus we are commanded by the book of Exodus, right, that we have to rest, while the socialist author of Deuteronomy, that's part of the debate, of course, is that if you say that, we'll put it this way, according to the Bible critics, Deuteronomy has the most impact of all the 5 books of Moses, most direct impact from the prophetic worldview. And so while we're all ordered to rest in the book of Exodus on the Sabbath, the socialist author of the book of Deuteronomy and Jeremiah, right? Very, very, very similar themes, sometimes identical between Jeremiah and the book of Deuteronomy and Jeremiah the prophet, bring the complete socialist explanation of the Sabbath. The wording is almost Jeremiah's, but it's taken from the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. So that like you, your male slave and female servant will also rest. The author of the Ten Commandments reminds you that you yourself were a slave in Egypt and therefore must release your slaves once a week so that they too may be free human beings. This is Sirkin now writing from the Lower East Side at the beginning of the 20th century. And from here, we have one more text where Sirkin now extrapolates from his discussion until this point, the Sabbath beginning with the Sabbatines, the revolution in the Bible, the prophetic, the socialist orientation of the prophets. And now he says, what can we understand from this concerning future historical development, which of course for a historian is impossible. You can't empirically tell the story of the future, story of future history. You can't tell future history empirically. No way. But you can analyze a form that a religious tradition puts in your mind, let's say through the idea of a Messiah or the prophetic concept of the end of days, and understand what ought to be or what is meant to be in the future in order for human history to be actually human and not a non-human history. And then here's what Sirkin says now, considering the future of humanity and the future history of humanity. And he continues again. I love the way he emphasizes it, because an Orthodox person can read the same text, but they'll never refer to the revolutionary heart of the prophet. I mean, it's all God, it's not the prophet. For Sirkin, but the revolutionary heart of the prophet is not satisfied with the Sabbath. It's just going now to what we mentioned, as most people think of the Sabbath as one day every 7 days, right? No, his heart, the socialist prophet's heart, yearns for a social Sabbath that is eternal, wherein all human beings will be free and live as brothers. It yearns for a Sabbath of Sabbaths, in Hebrew, Shabbat, Shabbaton, right? Yom Kippur, by the way, the Day of Atonement, which is the yearly symbol of the future Jubilee that comes at the end of history, at the end of days. So, right, that is also called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. The Jubilee is called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. The Shemitah, the sabbatical year, is also a Sabbath of Sabbaths because it comes after 7 cycles of 7 years that each included weekly Sabbaths of 7 days. Okay, so it learns for a Sabbath of the socialist prophet, the soul of the socialist prophet yearns for a Sabbath of Sabbaths, for a day which is nothing but Sabbath, right? If in 6 days we have to feed our mouths and we have to be selfish and we might even exploit each other, in the prophet's vision of the end of days, there's no exploitation, there's only justice. That is for the historical victory of the human spirit. That's what the end of days is in the prophetic consciousness, according to Sirkin. It demands that every 7th year the land shall rest and all its fruits and vegetables will be given free to the slaves, to the women servants, to manual labor, to the stranger and all those who have no property. Every 7 years the slave is to be freed. God has decreed that he be released, the slave be released unconditionally so that he may enjoy his freedom. And after you have counted 7 sabbatical years in the month of Tishrei, the holy month which has the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and 10 days later, the Day of Atonement, the most holy day of the great, in the month of Tishrei, on the Day of Atonement, a great trumpet, this is biblical, right? It's clear. A great trumpet will be sounded throughout the land, and liberty will be proclaimed for everyone. Everyone will have the right to reclaim the land and the home he was forced to sell or mortgage. Injustice will disappear, and the world will be redeemed, as though the Jubilee reenacts the Exodus from Egypt for all of humanity. Thus, the Sabbath became the foundational idea of social revolution, the basis upon which social justice will be built. And that's Sirkin on the Sabbath. This is really doesn't add anything else. It's just that it reminds me, there are anecdotes that come up on my mind very often that a couple of times, I mean, I've been thinking of Fiddler on the Roof. Somehow it keeps popping into my head lately. Why? One is because of what's going on in the world and what's going on in Israel. Even though I'm not a fundamentalist and I would never phrase something like that. I remember as they're leaving Anatevka, one of the townspeople comes up to the rabbi and says, wouldn't this be a good time for the Messiah to come? And sometimes things are so bad in the world that even if you don't believe that way, you feel like you should be asking the question. But what was the other thing from Fiddler on the Roof that as we're reading this, I just recalled, was Perchik, right? I have to tell you, I should be reading Shalom Aleichem because where it originated from, but this is the popular and this is what I know. And this is where the line is found. And Perchik is a radical socialist. He would have been of the same ilk, coming from the same background that Nachman Sirkin came from in the Pale of Settlement. And he's teaching the Bible about Laban and his daughters, and looking for a wife, for Isaac and stuff like that. And Perchik says, "And what do we learn from this?" And I forget what he says. He says, "But that you have to beat the capitalist, beat the employer." He gives his special, and that's why the Bible talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for the tooth. And Tevye says something like, and in this way, all of us capitalists, he doesn't say capitalists and socialists, but all of us will be then toothless and eyeless. Anyway, I just thought of that as the last thing. Of course, Sirkin has a different account. And this is something I think that's been lost, is that socialism here is an idea and an ideal, not the mechanism of government and economy. Those are necessary in order to fulfill the idea for Sirkin. But that's not the point. The point here is the ideal that's taught by the Sabbath.
Super, thank you so much. Let's open the floor to questions or online. Anybody like to raise their hand and ask a question or comment? I do have some questions. First of all, could you talk about the difference between the socialist Zionists and the Jewish Bund, the socialists of Yiddish extraction, basically?
Sure. Now you have to remember, I'm not a historian. I'm a scholar of Jewish thought and philosophy, which requires knowing history. But as an expert, these are questions that should go to a historian. I can answer what I know about them from the thinkers that I've talked at, and especially Sirkin, because Sirkin's very interesting. He wrote his essay, The Jewish Problem and the Socialist Jewish State, right? He wrote in 1899, which is 1 year, if I remember correctly, after the Bund, the Jewish socialist organization in Russia, was established. And Sirkin, in his travels, was in that preceding year, was very much a part of the Bund, a part of his discussions. And even more than that, this is very interesting. I'm going to give you a little bit of a synopsis of Sirkin's thinking on socialism and why the Jews need Zionism alongside of socialism. And what needs to be pointed out here is that even though Sirkin demanded a realization of Zionism before socialism could ever be realized, and a Jewish Zionist movement alongside of a Jewish socialist movement, meaning the Bund, right? So even though he thought that Zionism was necessary, he still thought that Jews should join the Bund as well, if they were to be both Zion. And that's in addition to him establishing a Zionist socialist federation, that Jews should belong to both the Zionist Federation and the Bund. What's his thinking here? His original thinking was, there was in his early thinking, you could see very clearly that his own animosity toward rabbinical Judaism, which was shared by most of the radical youth in the Pale of Settlement, brought him to the point that it was very natural to think that world socialism was going to solve the Jewish problem, and there was no other way to solve it. Until he realized the dynamics of the proletarian in socialist literature and started realizing that many of the revolutionary groups that he himself was personally involved in order to bring into the socialist movement the masses, the proletarian masses, that they would hook their socialist ideas into the associations and very often prejudices of the poorer classes in society where anti-Semitism was rampant. So Sirkin realized that as an ideal, socialism was great. Oh, thank you very much. But that, number one, it would take the socialist revolution such a long time to accomplish its goals that the Jewish people will be lost and continue to suffer and have even worse before socialism can help. Second, that the socialist movements, the actual organizations, were becoming more and more anti-Semitic because much of the proletariat was so anti-Semitic. So therefore, he really decided that Jews have to have their own organization, even as socialists. They need to do it as Jews. And the point here was that, and one of the brilliant things in that essay I mentioned of Sirkin beforehand, is how he shows, and it's pretty convincing, of course it's not foolproof, that the Jewish social and ethical ideals of the prophets, as an ideal of humanity being commanded by God, together with the experience of Jews in the Middle Ages, their experience of suffering at the hands of Christianity and at the hands of non-Jewish society, right? The suffering and the prophetic ideal together, he believes, put Jews at the beginning of the 20th century in the best place to be committed to socialism. And he explains that's why Jews, out of their proportion, were socialists. They considered it both a part of their secular Jewish heritage and also necessary in order to get along. So this actually now shows his entire attitude towards socialism. He identifies with socialism. He really believes that the worthy parts of the Bible, what makes the Bible and what it is, and what makes the image of God what it is, and all of its impact on Western history, comes from its socialist humanism. And he believes, and this is the last point here, that the Jewish people, as a Zionist, will have to create a continuation or a new Jewish culture, because they can't continue with the old traditional or even Orthodox one. And so what he's doing here is proposing a socialist, biblical Jewish culture. And that expresses both his identification with socialism and his feeling of that socialism isn't enough because of his Jewish perspective.
Okay, other questions? I do have another one. So certainly the interpretation that he gives to the Sabbath it shows a certain amount of respect for Jewish tradition as reflected in the Bible and Jewish thought. Where did that come from in his background?
Okay. Again, I can't think of anything explicit that would say this is the answer and there is no other. But once again, from my familiarity with him, I think it follows from the previous statement. For all Sirkin's criticism of rabbinical Judaism, even though, by the way, it's something that he moderated later on in life. Earlier in life, even though he extended it to all of rabbinical Judaism, was really a result of a very reactionary, ignorant, and oppressive position that was taken by many of the rabbis in the Pale of Settlement, either mimicking the orthodoxy that had already been born a while earlier in the more western parts of Eastern Europe or in Central Europe. But in any event, so he had this attitude against rabbinical Judaism because, as a member of his generation and who he was, he just could not tolerate the oppressiveness, and he saw the rabbis as joining the czar in the way that they oppress and, like just wipe away the freedom of the Jews or the youth or whoever it is. So we should remember that his antipathy for rabbinical Judaism is related to his experience at the end of the 19th century. But as you read him on a more, and know how familiar he was with Jewish texts and Jewish history, my answer would be based upon what he said concerning the Jewish experience at the hands of really vicious anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. There's a point when he says, remember if I mentioned a moment ago that for Sirkin, the infrastructure of the things he has to say here comes from a meeting between the prophetic ideal of the social and ethical ideal of the prophets and the experience of suffering at the hands of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. One of the ways that he put this was that for Jews, the Bible, meaning the prophets, commanded justice and love of the neighbor. This is, you could of course say the same thing for Christianity, but this is his Jewish consciousness in the Pale of Settlement, where there's a direct line from the Jewish experience in the Middle Ages to the Pale of Settlement. And remember, at this point, in Eastern Europe, Jews have not been a part of emancipated society yet. So the Middle Ages is still closer in a lot of ways than modern civil society. So now what does Sirkin say in that chapter in the essay that he wrote in 1899? So here you have Jews who are very proud because of their biblical heritage and because they're the people of the prophets, and they hear the leaders, whether it be the nobility or the kings or the church of the outside world, taking their authority supposedly from the same Bible that the Jews did, and very often even quoting the same verses about justice, about being good to your neighbor, and all of that stuff. But their own experience is that it's only, like I say in Hebrew, from the mouth and outward. They don't really mean it. Look at the way they treat us. So I think that his affinity for Judaism and the Bible is because, number one, is because it's his, it's Jewish, it's where he came from. And because now when the Jews have a chance, because of that biblical inspiration in his generation, they're all rushing toward humanism. They're all rushing towards socialism. And in his mind, this just shows that Judaism with its sources are superior than what the surrounding communities can claim. I think the affinity has to do with both what he learned and he appreciated, and the opposite reality, historical reality of the non-Jewish world that he met with as he went along, and as the Jewish people met with as they went along. It's that comparison and what he knew previously.
All right, somebody is listening.
Just a question. When you use the term the emancipation You talking about emancipation from serfdom, or you're talking about the legal emancipation of Jews in Western Europe? I'm a little confused
Right.
with the term emancipation.
This I already mentioned in the first class and went back to it every so often. It could be, I did use the term emancipation of the serfs today, didn't I? Because it was relevant. Normally when I use the term emancipation, because of the subject matter, we're talking about the legal emancipation of the Jews in the 19th century. The emancipation of the serfs is relevant here because in Eastern Europe, especially the Pale of Settlement, where there was no emancipation of Jews, there was recently an emancipation of the serfs, which is part of what caused the collapse of the Jewish economy. But that's a whole different story.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Turner.
Terrific. Next week, same trajectory, Moses Hess, a little bit earlier in time.
Super.
Terrific.